Pleased today to have Thomas Hawthorne with us, and along with being a professor of history at U of M Flint, he is the state scholar who is associated with the Smithsonian exhibit, and he will be helping all of the different groups across the state who get this exhibit to develop their programming. And so we're delighted that we're first, and we are able to show him off and show off the exhibit first here in Big Rapids. So without further ado, Thomas, you take over.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. So as I was so aptly introduced there, again, my name is Thomas Hawthorne, and as you guys can see, if you can see my screen, okay. I'm going to talk about Alexis De Toqueville and democracy in America. And particularly what I want to talk about with you guys today is De Tocqueville's ideas about free speech. And my goal here is to get you thinking about not just De Tocqueville, but a historic resource, a historic source itself, written almost 200 years ago, and thinking about how it can still be useful and relevant today. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started here. So first of all, I want to point out who Alexis de Tocqueville was. And one thing that I want to make clear is that you really don't have to go very far to hear the name Alexis de Tocqueville. If you're any kind of a political junkie, you're bound to run into Tocqueville's name because he's really one of the most frequently cited authors. And I always challenge my students to visit a local bookstore, and you could pick any book about modern American politics, and I'll guarantee you that there's at least a couple of citations in there to Tocqueville. So again, one of the most cited authors today. He's revered by both conservatives and liberals. He can tell us a great deal about what's happening in America in 1831 when he visits here. But I think he has a great deal to add to the conversation about America today. And as a result, then, even though it was written in 1835 and 1840, democracy in America is really kind of a living work. And that's what I hope I can demonstrate to you guys today. So who was Alexis de Tocqueville? First of all, I'll give you a little background on it. So Tocqueville was born in 1805 during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he was actually a member of French nobility. But he grew to adulthood in a world all but unrecognizable by his ancestors. Now, as a young man, he trained in the law, and he came to believe that democracy was the wave of the future for France and for Europe. So he arranged to come to America in 1831 to examine America. And after he published his book, it made him famous in France, and then translations soon appeared in England and America. And Tocqueville also served in the French National Assembly and was briefly France's foreign minister. And his History of the French Revolution is still regarded as kind of a classic work. And he dies at the age of 53. So what did Tocqueville write? He wrote 2 volumes of something called Democracy in America. And they were published in France in 1835, and then a second volume in 1840. But we tend to kind of squish them both together, both volumes, and put them in the same work these days. Now, the purpose of the book was actually to educate the French about democracy by describing and analyzing how American democracy worked, what it embodied. And he tries to paint a full picture of democracy. And this is really kind of key to understanding Tocqueville. He doesn't see democracy as just a form of government, but this all-encompassing way of life. Now, he visits the United States in 1831 with his good friend Gustave de Beaumont to study the new styles of the prison system in the US. And that's what he actually came here for. And he travels all over settled and unsettled parts of the American continent, and he observes, and he talks to people, and he looks at all kinds of different institutions and how they operate. And even though there's plenty of specific things going on, like the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the expansion of canals and railroads, you have this great westward migration of European settlers, the explosion of a free press. So as a matter of fact, 1831 was the year that William Lloyd Garrison began to publish his abolitionist paper, The Liberator. but Tocqueville's mostly looking at American institutions and politics. He's seen kind of as a, I don't know, kind of one of the earliest kind of political scientists, if you will. And a key observation Tocqueville makes is that the success of democracy hinges on vibrant political and social institutions, and that these things limit the power and encourage people to be active in politics. Now, of course, one of the most important of these institutions was the practice of free speech. And that's really what our focus on is on today, is free speech. And I just did something to, let's see if I can click forward. There we go. So he understands that freedom is fundamental to democratic society, and Tocqueville examines the freedom of speech, he examines its necessity, and he examines its dangers. And he also examines what the limitations are on freedom of speech. And this is important, not by law, all right, but by custom, all right? And he asked what the consequences are for speaking out against certain parameters that society defines. And as Tocqueville so often does, he takes a principle that Americans pride themselves for holding, and he asks really penetrating questions about its practice and about our customs around it. So talk is what the focus of this talk, I guess you could say, is all about. And that's what he says is fundamental to American society. Tocqueville says in a very real way, democracy is really all about talk, right? So in a vibrant, functioning, democratic, and just society, he says people have to talk, and they have to be free to talk, and they have to be free to talk a lot. Now, this isn't really an insight of Tocqueville, right? You can go back and read, for example, the funeral oration of Pericles, written all the way back in 430 BC. And Pericles emphasized the needs for citizens to talk formally in public debate, but also just to kind of talk about stuff. Human beings in a democracy, according to Tocqueville, have to communicate. He says they have to communicate openly, and they have to communicate often. And de Tocqueville saw what we still see in America today, that in a vibrant democracy, people have to talk. And again, we're talking mostly about the parameters around custom here. So Tocqueville was very aware of the Constitution, and he was very aware of the free of the First Amendment. So there's two types of ways to think about free speech. There's free speech as it's enshrined in the law, all right? And here's a brief part of the First Amendment right here, to where it says the government can't make laws to prohibit the free exercise of speech. But that's not really what Tocqueville's talking about. What he's talking about here is he's talking about free speech as it's practiced by ordinary Americans. This thing that we call the public sphere. So one of the things you'll discover if you walk around many communities, all right, especially communities that were created in the 19th century, is that the entire place is set up so people can talk. There's natural gathering places. So if you were to walk into a 19th century inn, for example, you wouldn't see little extra separate tables or booths or anything where people sat in isolation. They're big, long, common tables, all right, where you sat down and presumably you chatted with people who were at the table. And for somebody like Tocqueville, it would have been a complete stranger that he talked to. If you go into the large, prominent house of a prominent resident, what's the big room in the front? It's the parlor, the place for talking, a formal place in the house set aside for conversation. And if you go into a government building, there's a big place for people to assemble so they can get together and they can speak and they can address their fellow citizens. So talk there, central to democracy, and therefore freedom of speech is central to democracy. People not only have to talk, they have to be free to say what's on their mind. And yet, even as Tocqueville knows about the Constitution and the First Amendment, he says that some really interesting things about American society. He says that there are limits on speech in America. He says they're not placed there by the government, but placed there in a sense by the culture and by traditions. And Tocqueville's really pretty concerned about this. He's concerned about the fact that in theory and in law, there's virtually absolute freedom of speech. But in practice, it's not quite the same. And that's what we're really going to focus on for the rest of our time here. What Tocqueville's critique is of speech in America, seeing how it's curtailed and what some of the dangers are. So here's a great quote from Democracy in America. Tocqueville says, right here, he says, when I first arrived in America, I went to all kinds of meetings, and I was really impressed by the breadth and passion and the amount of free speech I heard. So that's a really great quote right there. And Tocqueville says that when you're part of the majority, all right, and by majority here, he doesn't mean a political party or a particular organization, but if you're in the mainstream of thought about American life and institutions, all right, you're fine, right? These kinds of rules are acceptable. And if you believe what most people believe, all right, if you're close to what most people believe, you'll be able to speak out. And so he listens to discussions about building churches. He listens to all kinds of meetings at various political groups about the upcoming elections. And he noted that there were always discussions, both informal and formal, about making your community a better place, about making public improvements, about making streets better. He even said the one thing they talk about the most is schools. And in fact, he makes a really interesting observation. He said that he was surprised by the number of women that attended these discussions. In 1831, they're caught up in it too. They're a part of the democratic process as they form clubs, albeit indirectly because they don't have access to public office or franchise. But he's noting that idea about the impressed by, again, that breadth of and passion and the amount of free speech. But despite all that free speech, here's another quote of Tocqueville, right? He says, despite all that, he found less independence of mind and freedom of discussion, despite all the talk he'd heard, than any place he had ever been, all right? Now, I think that's pretty interesting. So as an historian, and Dr. Peterson, I think you would probably agree with me too, one of the other attendants here, that when you see a contradiction in the sources like this, that's when the hairs on the back of your neck really start to stand up and you say, hey, well, what's going on here? What's happening here with this? And I think that's a really fascinating quote. So he goes on to explain exactly what he means by this, right? And he goes and revisits that idea of the majority, right? He says the majority, and remember, we're not talking about a political party or faction. He says the majority has raised a really big tent. And big tent is my term. I think it's a good visual. At one point, Tocqueville actually talks about a circle of thought. But anyway, if you think about it, Americans, according to Tocqueville, have raised a big tent. And within this tent, there are a lot of things that Americans are free to talk about and free to say. And I don't mean free legally, because that's not what we're talking about here. He's not talking about law. Again, he's talking about practice. He's talking about the way people respond to each other in this tent. And he says this tent's pretty big. And inside the tent, there's complete freedom of discussion and thought. And if you want to put it in modern terms today, you can be a liberal or you can be a conservative. You can be a Republican or you can be a Democrat within this tent. But Tocqueville also says that those ideas that are outside the big tent are actually the butt of jokes and the object of persecution. Now, this persecution isn't physical. You don't get thrown in jail for speaking your mind in America. You aren't arrested for spouting what we might say are very radical or unconventional ideas. So, for example, you aren't arrested if you admit that you're a Marxist in the United States. So this is, again, we're not talking about the government here. What he does say is those outside the tent are cut off from power. Political careers are closed to those outside the tent. That's very interesting. So I want to throw a couple of examples out there for you that might help us get at what Tocqueville's talking about. So there's all sorts of campus groups on campus where I teach, and some lean to the left and some lean to the right. But what you won't find on campus are groups that are so far left or so far right that they fall outside the tent. For example, there's no white supremacist groups on campus. There's no student communist organizations on campus. There's a Democratic Socialist Club, but despite its name, it's really a fairly moderate kind of liberal group. So that's inside the tent. And again, we'll take a look at that term socialist. Here's another great example, right? One of the very effective ways political operatives undermine the legitimacy of left-leaning policies is to accuse them of just being socialist. It doesn't matter if they are or not. Once somebody puts a label on a policy or a policymaker as a socialist, that's a pretty big hole to dig yourself out of, because that's way outside kind of the tent of acceptable ideas. And that's exactly the sort of thing Tocqueville has in mind. Again, he's not talking about legal violations. He's not talking about somebody's First Amendment rights being violated. We're making a distinction here. He's talking about really the realm of public opinion. So let me use another metaphor here instead of the tent. So the majority that he's talking about, right, says that this is the playground we're going to play on. And you can play anywhere you want to on this playground, and we'll go back and forth on the playground. And you know, you can easily be penalized. You can be timed down, or you can be put on base, or whatever we do on playgrounds these days to penalize people, right? But if you get off the playground, you're not going to have any influence on society anymore. You'll lose your voice, and you'll lose any realistic opportunity to obtain or to affect political power. Tocqueville says the majority does intellectual violence to those who are outside the circle, right? That this big circle that they've established. People are free from physical violence, but he says they're treated as strangers. People outside the tent keep their privileges. So we might say they keep their rights, but those rights and privileges aren't of any use to them anymore, because they're kind of written off as kooks or cranks or just plain dangerous. Oh, I had a stunning illustration here, I think. Yeah. So again, so this is the idea of those far to the left or far to the right ideas. So that's really kind of interesting, right? About this kind of less freedom of mind when you think about America compared to other nations, both in the 19th century and in the 21st century. So in some nations in Europe, if a political party, for example, gets 5% of the vote, it gets representation in parliament. Doesn't matter what their ideas are like, right? Or the National Assembly, or whatever you call it. They have a seat at the table. But here in our two-party system, we have these parties that they consistently get. We have other parties that consistently get small percentages of the vote, but they never elect anybody to the legislature. So those people aren't able to participate in government. In a very real sense, this two-party system is an example of this kind of big tent. Now remember, the two-party system is formed by tradition, not by law. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that we have to have a two-party system. And Tocqueville is really concerned about this. He says that there's other societies that allow a wider range of voices and actually take a wider range of voices seriously. Even though America, in theory and in law, there's virtually absolute freedom of speech, there's a difference between theory and how it's actually practiced. So in the 19th century and even today by law, Europe looks much more constricted in its speech than America does. But in practice, Tocqueville's actually not so sure. So he's actually thinking of, if you think of Europe in the 19th century, after this kind of, after the French Revolution and the idea of kind of radical change in governments, revolution's a dirty word in Europe, right? So they're really kind of cracking down on things there. But he even sees that as like a much more open society willing to discuss broadly different types of ideas. And he worries a lot about that. And I think it's something for us to think about and maybe be concerned about too. He says those who disagree significantly from the majority find themselves in isolation and despair. So the majority, in a sense, kind of sets the agenda. And as a result, Tocqueville questions whether Americans truly have the freedom of mind necessary to really lead a world that's increasingly marching towards democracy. Tocqueville says we can say whatever we want without being arrested, but if we say certain things, we essentially remove ourselves from serious discussion. And again, he's talking about something called the public sphere, that place in society where discussions take place. So in 1831, that place was public gathering places, churches, city halls, theaters, pubs, newspapers, right? Over time, that place of public discussion has changed. And we've added TV. And now a great deal of public discussion happens online, especially in social media. So a big question we can ask ourselves here is now that the place for public discussion has moved online, one question that I always kind of ask myself here is, how does the majority set the agenda, right? And remember, we're not talking about we're not talking about government, we're talking about private companies running online corporations and running social media, the same way private companies run newspapers in the 19th century. And so these types of questions that Tocqueville posed almost 200 years ago, they're just as relevant, even though the medium's changed. So here's kind of a question I like to throw out there. And Roxanne, you can tell me if people are allowed to freely, respond to this, is what do people think about Tocqueville's Big Tent? Do they have any questions about that? Don't make me call on you. Well, here's another thing to think about here too. It's another way to kind of push the conversation forward. If we think about this Big Tent, this era of public discussion being online, are the policies of social media platforms consistent with Tocqueville's understanding of free speech? And I always like to kind of put one up here. So here's one that we have here. So, I think this is especially kind of relevant considering the decisions, and the role social media has played in our latest elections. Again, so this is Twitter. This is from one of Twitter's policy on something they call civic integrity, and how you can't use Twitter for the purposes of manipulating or interfering in elections or other civic processes. It includes posting or sharing content that suppresses participation or misleads people on how to participate in the civic process. Does that seem like it's kind of in line with what Tocqueville has said? Is it part of that Big Tent? Here's a question I like to think about is the tent getting bigger? Or as a result of social media, is the tent getting smaller, right? Is there less accepted, are there less accepted ideas than there may have been in 1831? Dr. Peterson, you unmuted.
Well, I mean, I don't want to rain on your parade here, but we just had a political engagement project at Ferris. We just had a 4-part series about free speech and social media, where we had a domestic perspective, a theoretical perspective, and then we brought even outside Germany and the Russian angle. And the question that people kept coming to is trying to decide if social media is a private or is it private or is it a public type of engagement process? Or what I mean by that, should we treat these as private ways of communicating, or are these public spheres that should be open to everybody regardless of what they have? And it seems to me like a lot of what we got from the feedback from the various people is that the way that social media is set up is if you don't like what you hear, people just make their own avenues of communicating with each other. So it splinters the public sphere. So if I'm on Twitter and I whatever, you have hate speech or you have things that can be roughly construed as destroying the civic process, I'll just find my own means of communicating with people who think like me. So the problem that people have is that you can't have a discourse and exchange of ideas in ways that you might have been able to in the past, at least in theory, that it's splintering to the point where it's all confirmation bias. It's all people just getting what they want. And if they don't like what they see or see contrary views, they just go somewhere else where people will tell them what they want to hear. And what does that mean for citizenship if we just decide to only interact with people who think like us, tell us what we want to hear, and pretty much ostracize any any platform that gives us contrary information. So there are a lot of people that are the gist of what I took from a lot of people in our platform is that the public sphere is shrinking, and we have to figure out what it is very quickly, not only in terms of law, but in terms of how a representative democracy is going to function. So I think your presentation so far is very interesting and right on point with the issues you're raising, for not only us here, but for students. I think it's great, and it's fundamental stuff to think about.
And I can't take credit, right? Remember, it's Tocqueville, right?
Yeah.
It's this French guy who comes to the United States in 1831, and he makes these observations, and yeah, I mean, and really, that's always the kind of the point of why I like sharing this is, I find that when I go back and I look at Tocqueville, and I've got the 2-volume. I'm such a geek. I look through it all the time. It's amazing to me the different ways that you could go back and look at Tocqueville and bring him up again. And again, so taking this idea of the public sphere. So I had a conversation not long ago with my students about this in my early US history class. And one of the things I thought about is this conversation about mainstream media. They were kind of, they were talking about on social platforms online that, that maybe these days the big tent is the mainstream social media, so Twitter, Facebook, and stuff, and maybe are those are the people outside the tent, are they just finding, if they find that they can't get their voice heard within this circle, within the mainstream, do they just kind of have ways to talk with one another and everything outside that? I think that's always existed to some extent, right? But I think the difference these days are access. It's so much easier to access somebody else's ideas who are outside the mainstream of political thought than it would have been 100 years ago. It would have been very difficult to find somebody who it would have been very difficult for somebody who thought differently from everybody else to get their ideas out to a large audience. It's just so much easier these days.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I mean, like I said, and as you said, is the tent getting smaller, and what are the implications for democracy? And one question I thought of too is, as these social media is how democratic are the processes? How democratic have the processes been in the past for determining how big that tent is, and are they less democratic processes now than what they are now? Who's making the rules these days about what we can talk about? Are there fewer people involved in making those rules? Are there more people? Does it seem more democratic? And my students always come back and say that the interesting thing about kind of free speech on social media is they say that it has the veil of more democracy, but they're not quite sure if it and I think that's, again, I think Tocqueville would say, yeah, he would catch us on that. Yeah.
I think it's always interesting to pair de Tocqueville. Like I'm kind of with you on this. I've always been fascinated by de Tocqueville. I read him even when I was in high school and read him in college. It's one of those things that kept coming up, and then I got the volume and kept reading more of it. I've taken classes on it on the side. I mean, I'm such a nerd. I even bought the what's that thing called? The Great Courses series on Tocqueville, so I could listen to it while I was driving across the country.
They've got a guy on there that does. They've got one just for Tocqueville.
Yeah. I bought it because when I drive out east to see my son lives in Vermont, so I want something in the car to listen to. So I get nerd shows like World War II and Tocqueville.
Yeah,
I think it's always interesting to pair him with Walter Lippmann in terms of his arguments about public opinion and democracy. Like someone like Lippmann after World War I, and I'm sure you know all of this, but I mean, to me, the fear of of people believing things that aren't accurate, how people, whether it's government, corporations, other things, can manipulate people into believing things that aren't true. And democracy really has no way of dealing with it. If the public opinion believes something, even if it's garbage, what do you do? What does that mean for government if they actually believe something that's not true, which can be easily done? The public is this is stuff that goes back to the Federalist Papers and Madison being easy, manipulable, volatile. what happens in it if you have self-government based on ideas that are patently wrong, but people believe them. And that gets into the whole argument about the public spheres with radio, then television, and so forth. But I think you've got it. And then you get into all this stuff about it was not as democratic. I mean, so the argument I see in a lot of this literature that I've read about the internet is, so go back, say, even with television or newspapers in the golden age, there were a lot of gatekeepers that filtered in a lot of stuff like the John Birch Society in the 50s and other arguments that kept them away. They still influenced some people, but they never became mainstream because people kind of filtered them out. And that's which obviously is gone with the internet. And so you can make an argument that that wasn't democratic. But someone like Libin would say that's okay because of what's at stake here. You need gatekeepers. And another thing I think has changed too is the way that politicians used to be more gatekeepers and keeping some of these ideas on the mainstream or out of the mainstream. Like someone like Ronald Reagan with the Birch Society stuff, that Eisenhower was a communist and so forth. They kind of, or even William Buckley kind of kept that away. That filter system is obviously breaking down, and people worry now is there's too much information out there, too much democracy, too much of the ability of these ideas to go from computer to computer in this new whatever you want to call it, public or private sphere, that makes democratic citizenship more challenging than it ever was before. So if people, how do you find mechanisms if the gatekeeping system is broken down because of social media to engage people in ideas? I mean, to be perfectly blunt, but let's just take one example. If you want to convince people that these conspiracy theories about the QAnon conspiracy theories are wrong, I mean, how do you do that? Because when you tell people, like I have family members who generally find them pretty believable, that a lot of Democratic candidates and politicians are pedophiles. How do you get them not to believe that? I can sit there and tell them that they're wrong, but they're just be, oh, you're corrupt, you're part of the system. But the message, they keep seeing it on social media, they find the ways to do it. How do you tell people that, something is not accurate without being kind of considered either part of the conspiracy or limiting their rights to access information?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
it's kind of interesting because
we
had that same conversation on Wednesday when Deb Simmons presented, because she was talking about spotting disinformation and misinformation, and we're like, but when you talk to somebody who believes a conspiracy theory, they always have an answer, and which is that's what they want you to think, and you can't really get around it.
Yeah. So yeah, it's all. I mean, to me, these are the $1 million questions.
Yeah.
And Toqueville is not to the same. He's not talking about the same things. He lives in a different time, but the issues that he raised I think are good ones.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing is how you paired Toqueville with Walter Lippmann. And what I like to do is I pair Toqueville with another 20th century authors. I pair him with Gunnar Myrdal, because both of them are foreigners.
Interesting.
And both of them really ask tough questions about American democracy. And what's really interesting is that, to some extent, Americans are willing to maybe listen to foreigners sometimes on some of these issues there, because maybe sometimes people are seen as more objective this way. But I think it's interesting how both of those authors, and for those that don't know, Gunnar Myrdal wrote a book about race in America. It's called The American Dilemma, and it's all about the inability of America to kind of put its money where its mouth is and extend freedom and equality to non-whites. Basically is what he's talking about. And again, he has really, really kind of poignant questions about that at another moment in American history where things are rapidly changing, and we're undergoing a great deal of kind of social upheaval, but Myrdal's ideas are listened to by quite a few. You see so many, you see his ideas kind of trickle into not just American academia, but American policy, which is really kind of interesting. And we don't, there's not as many people talk. I don't think you're going to find him as quote wide. You'll find probably, a fraction of the citations to Myrdal in the back of a book about American politics. But I mean, again, it's again, I think it's always interesting how sometimes these outside observers come in, and kind of look at it and say, "Oh, is that how you guys are doing that?" I think that's kind of interesting. But did you know that, so for Tocqueville to point out, well, you guys really like this free speech stuff, but did you know you're kind of limiting what people can talk to you about that? I don't think Americans can get away with that as easily as a foreign observer could. And I always kind of find that interesting. And even today, if we are talking about different like realms of information and different amount of choices in how we get that information, I think it's important to realize too is that the amount of information people had access to in 1835 must have seemed like, somebody opened Pandora's box compared to what it was 50 years ago, even, with not just technology and stuff. So I think it's interesting. What did people in the 1830s really think about all of this kind of explosion of free press and, especially even, the explosion of literature and you even have the transcendental movement and everything like that. Is that too much talk going on? It's much more talk than they would have been, used to a generation before. And I always kind of think about that I mean, I think comparatively, yeah, we're facing a lot more information than they are. But what did they really think about it? Too, and I think that's always a question to kind of bring folks back to at times.
Yeah, I always when Tocqueville talks about how Americans devour newspapers and the newspaper industry, I think of like even I experienced that, and I'm in my mid 40s. When I was a kid, my dad would like give me a quarter or whatever, 50 cents, and make me go to the grocery store, like on the weekends to get the paper. So newspapers were still big when I was in high school. I had to figure out the sports scores, to figure out what was going on. It was a big deal. It was a big ritual in my house right until I left for college in the mid 90s to go get the newspaper at the gas station. I would walk about 2 blocks. My dad said, you're young enough. You're in good shape. Go get the newspaper. And now that just seems like a completely different world. Like I can't imagine. Like I wanted to know the score of a sporting event last night, the Pittsburgh Penguins. I'm a hockey fan. Like I can't imagine having to wait till the next day to figure that out.
Yeah.
It's crazy to me. So yeah, so the Tocqueville question, the Lippmann, Murdahl, I mean, you can go on and on and on. I mean, it's the stuff we talked about with the fairness doctrine, the way that politics gets weaponized and turned into kind of a warfare during the 1990s. I'm still amazed. I go back and read it. There's books by people like, I'm blanking on his name. I've read tons of his stuff. Who wrote that recent book about Newt Gingrich's influence on politics in the 1990s? The famous American political historian.
Oh, I'd be a blank too.
I listened to it on New York Times book reviews when I was driving last time. I'm temporarily blanking. It'll come to me. But how Gingrich was part of this movement among many in the 90s to weaponize politics in terms of scorched earth policy, like question the legitimacy of political opponents, question people who differed from the orthodoxy of the party in terms of like no taxes. Like really, he compared it. There was an article in the Atlantic where Gingrich compared politics. He said politics should be more like a zoo, where basically animals, kill each other in this social Darwinian, struggle, and how that's kind of influenced politics. And social media comes in right as you see the movement in the 90s against Clinton and, 2000 election. And that kind of dovetails with this kind of, upping political rhetoric in ways that you'd seen it before in American history, but, and people, and people in the 1960s were worried that the American parties were too similar, that they got along too well, that they didn't differentiate each other enough, that we needed a choice. We needed the parties to sort themselves out. And as George Will argued in his recent book, do people like sorted out parties? is that working better for us? And now exacerbated by the social media phenomena? Do we like the parties being this hostile to each other? So your talk is very good. I'm glad you were invited to do this, because I think it comes together with all these issues that we're trying to do here at Ferris in terms of social media, in terms of citizenship. Yeah. I'm going to do the talk about voting coming up. I think it all comes together very nicely here.
Yeah, and if at the end of the day, if I can convince somebody to even just Google Alexis De Tocqueville and read a little bit more about him and everything like that, I'll have considered and actually like, oh, here's a primary source or something like that, or take me up on my challenge to go to, to look for him, in referenced somewhere. I'll consider myself, I've won one for the cause.
I hope I'm going to try. I mean, unless someone has a problem with it, I'd like to make this available to my students.
Yeah, again, it's so. I mean, and it's a way to get people to kind of go back and look at those primary sources, and one of my goals as a historian is to try to get people to see the relevance of history, to today.
For sure.
Right. And so again, that's what kind of I started off with talking, as I said, how what does some French guy in A2 visiting the United States in 1831 have anything to do with Twitter's policy? Is there a way that you can make a connection? And I think if you're creative enough,
sure.
you could figure out ways to make these things relevant and make them interesting topics of conversation. And that's, like I said, that's always my goal. I think Tocqueville's one way, to do it. Another way I always bring people up is the most important election in American history. I always tell is the election of 1896. So that's the other topic I talk about at length.
I do a lot of my classes with William Jennings Bryan's speech about is America going to be a country from the top down or the bottom up?
Yeah,
I mean, and like across the gold and all that other stuff. But it's interesting how he words that in terms of how you understand American history. I think is relevant today. And if you don't mind, I mean, people jump in if I'm taking up too much of the conversation, but I like this kind of stuff.
Yeah, me too. I'm a junkie when it comes to this, this kind of thing.
Have you done anything with Tocqueville in terms of these debates we're having, especially in academia, but it's filtering into the workplace about how people are concerned? Like you have that outfit Persuasion that's out there trying to, it's called Persuasion. It sends all this stuff about protecting free speech and the threats to free speech in society. Like Jonathan Haidt and others are part of that, about like connecting free speech to like therapeutic issues, things like trigger warnings or not having people having subjects taboo because they might offend somebody or might give people psychological harm. Have you dealt with any of those types of issues with your students?
So yeah, no. So that one came up last year. So I should say this is like one of the ways that I use Tocqueville the most is I subject my students to them. So I teach United States history. So what I do is I'll always figure out a way to spend at least 2 weeks on Tocqueville, no matter what the subject is in my class.
I kind of do that with Thoreau a little bit.
There's always a way. I even when I do the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, I figure out a way to fit Tocqueville in there. So that's mostly the ways that we do that. And of course the trigger warnings came up. I think it would have been last year during my just U.S. history survey course when we were talking about that in how different kind of triggers, safe spaces and things like that. And are these safe spaces? And it's always good to hear students' feedback on it, because one is they've heard of Tocqueville, but they haven't heard much about them and stuff. So these are new ideas to them, at least the ideas of Tocqueville. So it's always interesting to hear back from them on what their opinions are about, and they all think these ideas about having the right kind of spaces that are welcoming and accessible to people are important, and I say I couldn't agree more. I said, what do you think Tocqueville would say about that? Does he think we're making the tent bigger or making the tent smaller by those, and let's take a look and let's see what he has to say. So those are the times where I've seen students kind of seen folks kind of engage about that debate. So those are the times they've come up, and again, most of the conversations and things that I have with them are usually with my students when I subject them to figuring out a way. I'm trying to figure out how I can do my modern U.S. class, and I don't know, figuring out a way to do Tocqueville in that one, but I haven't quite.
Yeah, it's a little harder.
Yeah.
Into that, but I mean, to me, it's interesting. Like that's why I use the Lepore textbook. I mean, the Lepore textbook that she came out with, that new book, is not perfect, and she makes some what I even say was pretty surprising, like factual errors. but she does bring the citizenship issue into it and talks about Lippmann, talks about others, talks about political, the rise of the public opinion industry of advertising in the 20th century. So at least I like it because she gives people at least a vehicle to begin to think about citizenship issues. And another thing that I think is interesting about de Tocqueville, although before this, I'm going to preface this, like the socialism thing, a political engagement project or the history area, we're going to have a panel in the fall about this because I've just about had it. We were going to have a panel about what the term socialism and communism actually mean.
What it actually means, yeah.
Yeah, we were going to do it this semester, but the election stuff took that over. We had to do panels on the election. I had to do stuff for PEP about what was going on in February about this stuff. But I've had it. I'm up to here, so we're gonna do that. I might even ask you to participate in that if you might be interested.
Sure,
but
sure.
But the the thing with Tocqueville I also found particularly interesting is when he talks about the free speech stuff, and a couple things come out, how sick and tired he got of Americans telling him how great America is. Like he just got, I mean, just like enough of this. Yes, you got some good stuff going, but the whole stuff of how the free speech issues overlap with how Americans differentiate themselves from each other in a land built, at least in theory, on equality. Like, how do you tell the difference between people? Like in medieval Europe, you have like the peasants, the feudal system of gradations of wealth, but in America, how do people differentiate themselves? And a lot of that turned into consumption. He's got very interesting arguments about how consumption is going to be a challenge for democracy in the coming years. And that kind of overlaps a little bit with free speech, when people are going to say, I'm better than you because of what I own, as opposed to who I am. And to me, that's another angle of these free speech issues and citizenship issues, not only go into like the free speech stuff, but how consumerism and the ability to define citizenship by more consumer-oriented standards rather than free speech standards in the public sphere is an issue I think is also interesting, especially entering the 20th century. So I was wondering if you've done anything with that aspect of de Tocqueville's thought.
Well, so one of the things I like about Tocqueville is how he kind of has a little bit of a crystal ball, in some sense. And so one of the things that I think Tocqueville hits pretty close on is the way he kind of understands how Americans kind of see themselves. I should say this is how the idea of American equality is pretty exclusive. Yeah. In the sense that Americans use the idea, of equality as a way to kind of, exclude other people and to, make themselves, and to kind of differentiate themselves in who's more equal than the other person. And in a lot of ways, it really kind of, you're right, it has a lot to do with the growing urban middle class in the 19th century. Very, very close ties to how people understand what's equal, what's American, what's successful. All those kind of things get kind of tied up into one of those. And if we want to kind of, put Tocqueville's spin on it for free speech, is even kind of what's acceptable patterns of consumption. What would be, you could even take free speech and put it in the form of practice, right? I mean, speech is, it's stuff that comes out of your mouth, but it's also, the actions we take. So I think you can definitely take, Tocqueville's theories about what's acceptable talk and think about what's acceptable practice, and how some practices make you, outside of, kind of put you outside the tent and put you outside the kind of mainstream of thought. I think one thing that he misses, though, is that he misses how we eventually accept the super rich. So that's very un-Republican in the 19th century, Republican with a small r, to be super wealthy, and everything like that. And I think he kind of, because that's kind of, that's European and that's kind of, elitist and everything like that. So in one sense, he kind of sees that, but I think Tocqueville would say somebody like Vanderbilt, and his consumption patterns are probably outside the tent, and he would think, but by the time we get to J.P. Morgan and those guys at the end of the 19th century and Carnegie and stuff, they're inside. We've changed what's acceptable behavior and everything. So So, so it's a good example of where he's kind of got this crystal ball, but then, there's obviously you can't see everything. He misjudges that. I mean, that's my theory. I mean,
oh no, you're on this. I use that when we go over the late 1800s. I show them pictures of like the Carnegie stuff, the Rockefellers, the mansion that they build in North Carolina, that big house that the Vanderbilt family builds in North Carolina, the Biltmore Estate. Compare that with like Jacob Riis's
or something like that.
Yeah, like then compare that with like the Danish immigrants, Jacob Riis's pictures of the urban poor.
Yeah.
And so forth. So, but I do think there's something to be said for all of this. Going back to De Tocqueville, I mean, I use him as a crystal ball. When I had an NEH grant to do for high school teachers about U.S.-Russian history relations together a few years ago, we started with De Tocqueville's comment about how America and Russia are going to rule the world today based on completely opposite principles, like of approaching free speech and government. But what it seems to me, this idea that Tocqueville, and you got to it very well, is this idea of the private sphere, that Americans are going to undermine their democracy potential over the long term by retreating into something resembling a private sphere and disengaging from the public, which is why Tocqueville, and you know this as well as anybody, the health of a democracy is people showing up at town meetings. Yeah, it's being engaged. That's how you can tell if a community is good. It's actually good to have shows like Parks and Rec where people are arguing about things in public at town meetings. And so what does that mean? If people just decide to retreat into these private spheres of the internet, whether these are public or private forums is a matter of debate. But if people decide their citizenship is ripping people apart on the internet or going into their like-minded forums about how Biden stole the election or why on the left, maybe, why vaccines are going to kill Americans. I don't know. I mean, whatever your forum, is that by definition going to undermine the public sphere that we need to have a functioning democracy? Because he calls this soft dictatorship eventually, where the government tells everybody what to do because people don't give a crap. I almost swore there. To me, those are interesting debates. You could create a whole class of citizenship around those issues, and that's why I'm glad that you mentioned them here for our community.
Yeah, and here's something that I thought of too, is like if we think about the 2020 election, and even if COVID weren't happening and we could freely join in our town halls or something like that, is would people show up to a local town hall or something like that about a specific issue, or would they be more interested in debating it on social media? And and if we want to turn the clock back, I mean, the example would be for Tocqueville is, if he saw more people arguing about something within newspapers, as opposed to arguing about them in the town square, would he be concerned?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because it's a different kind of a different medium. So, I mean, I would actually think today, I think even without COVID, I think more people would prefer to argue something online than they would be to show up to their local. I mean, in Flint, our city council holds a few hundred people, and even when we're talking about lead in the water, I mean, that place is never full. So I think that would really concern Tocqueville quite a bit. The fact that the types of, again, is the internet really a public sphere, or is it a private sphere that we've retreated into? In a sense, especially if you compare it to like a public gathering space that's been designed for us to engage each other as citizens and engage our elected officials, and we're choosing not to do that. We're choosing to use a different forum. And I think Tocqueville would be a little troubled,
for sure,
by that. Yeah.
Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. I'm not sure when our Zoom will just shut off on us. So I want to thank you so much.
Thomas, can I find your email very easily online?
Yeah, just my last name, Henthorne.
Okay. I'm going to I'll maybe even send you some stuff. I've got all this material, like the panel series that we did, in case you're interested.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Love to see it. Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Thank
Christian,
you.
thank
Thank
you
you,
for
everyone.
coming. And reminder that Christian's going to be speaking next Friday at this
Yes,
time.
shameless promotion for Christian.
It is, it really is.
And then Wednesday at noon, we'll also be talking with Ruth Gilmore Langs, the painter of the Free USA series. So we have two more things next week, and we have a full month full of presentations. So check the artworksinbigrapids.org. That's where the calendar is. And please join us again. And thank you all for coming.